A narcissist's worst nightmare is someone who stops needing them. There's a specific kind of fear that lives underneath every narcissist's charm, every performance, every carefully managed relationship, and it has nothing to do with abandonment in the way most people imagine it. It's not the fear of being alone. It's the fear of becoming irrelevant to someone who used to need them. And once you understand why that specific fear runs so much deeper than ordinary heartbreak, you'll understand something about narcissistic psychology that explains almost everything else we've covered on this channel. Let's start with a distinction that matters enormously, because it's the whole foundation of today's episode. Being left and being outgrown are not the same experience for a narcissist, even though they might look similar from the outside. Being left, even a painful, humiliating departure, can usually be absorbed into an existing narrative. The person was unstable, ungrateful, never really understood what they had, wasn't ready for a real relationship. These stories, however inaccurate, still center the narcissist as a stable reference point, someone whose value the other person simply failed to recognize. Being outgrown is different, and it's different in a way that removes that narrative entirely, because it doesn't say, "You didn't appreciate me." It says something far more threatening. "I appreciated you fully, for a long time, and then I built something inside myself that no longer requires you to feel complete." That second story is the one a narcissist's psychology cannot metabolize, and today we're going to walk through exactly why. To understand this fully, we need to go back to something we've discussed across several episodes on this channel. A narcissist's sense of self isn't internally generated the way it is for most people. It's relational, externally sourced, dependent on a continuous supply of attention, admiration, and, this is the piece that matters most for today's topic, need. Being needed isn't just pleasant for a narcissist. It's structurally load-bearing. It confirms, moment to moment, that they matter, that they hold power, that their presence in someone's life is not optional, but essential. This is why narcissists so often gravitate toward partners who are, at least initially, somewhat dependent, not necessarily financially, though that happens too, but emotionally, psychologically, in ways that create an ongoing requirement for the narcissist's continued involvement. Someone who needs you is, in a very real sense, tethered to you. And a narcissist's entire relational strategy, whether consciously calculated or not, is built around maintaining that tether for as long as possible, because the tether is the actual source of their sense of significance. This is where the worst nightmare in today's title actually lives. A person who once needed them, who has since built enough internal stability, enough external support, enough genuine self-sufficiency, that the tether simply isn't there anymore. Not because of anger, not because of a dramatic falling out, but because that person quietly, steadily, stopped requiring anything from the narcissist to feel whole. This is categorically different from someone who's still angry, still hurt, still emotionally entangled even in their resistance. Anger is still a tether. Hurt is still a tether. Someone who's furious with a narcissist is still, in a real sense, organized around them. What actually terrifies a narcissist is indifference born of genuine self-sufficiency, not performed indifference. Not the kind of pointed, "I'm so over you" energy that's secretly still seeking a reaction, but the real thing. A person who has simply moved their center of gravity elsewhere, and for whom the narcissist has become, structurally, optional. Let's talk about why this specific configuration is so uniquely destabilizing, because it's worth breaking into its actual psychological components. The first component is the collapse of the narcissist's usual toolkit. We've talked at length across this channel about the standard playbook, rage, guilt, charm, and, when those fail, the flattery and recruitment tactic we covered in an earlier episode. Every single one of these tools is designed to work on a specific kind of target, someone who still has an emotional stake in the outcome, someone whose reaction can still be provoked because some part of them still cares what the narcissist thinks, wants, or does. Someone who has genuinely stopped needing them removes the raw material every one of these tactics depends on. You cannot enrage someone into re-engagement if they've become genuinely unbothered. You cannot guilt someone into coming back if their sense of worth no longer runs through the narcissist's approval. You cannot charm someone who no longer requires the specific validation the charm was designed to supply. The entire toolkit, built and refined over years, simply has nothing to work against, and a craftsman with tools that no longer function on anything is left facing a kind of helplessness they've rarely, if ever, experienced. The second component is what this specific situation does to the narcissist's internal narrative about their own significance. We discussed in an earlier episode how narcissists mistake compliance for character, assuming that someone who's gone quiet, who's stopped fighting, who's stopped needing things from them, has simply been defeated, rather than having genuinely moved on. But eventually, if the pattern holds long enough, even that comfortable misreading becomes impossible to sustain, because a person who's actually thriving, actually building something real and independent, produces evidence that doesn't fit the "they're just suppressing their need for me" story. Thriving looks different from suppression, even from a distance, and eventually the narcissist has to confront a possibility their psychology has spent a lifetime avoiding, that they were never actually as central to this person's life as their own self-concept required them to believe. The third component, and this is perhaps the most psychologically significant one, is what genuine self-sufficiency in someone else does to a narcissist's ability to locate their own worth relative to that person. So much of narcissistic self-esteem operates comparatively, not fixed, internal confidence, but a constantly shifting sense of status relative to whoever's currently in the picture. Someone who needs them provides an easy, reliable comparison. I am needed, therefore I have value. Therefore I am, in this specific relational equation, the more significant party. Someone who has stopped needing them removes that comparison entirely, and without it, the narcissist is left facing something they have almost no practice sitting with: an assessment of their own worth that doesn't have another person's dependency to lean on for confirmation. This is why so many narcissists respond to an ex-partner, an estranged family member, or even a former friend visibly, genuinely thriving without them with something that looks, from the outside, wildly disproportionate to the situation. A level of preoccupation, agitation, or fixation that seems bizarre given how much time has passed, or how little actual contact remains between the two people. What's actually happening internally isn't really about missing the specific person in most cases. It's about confronting the unbearable possibility that their presence in someone's life was never as load-bearing as their entire identity had required it to be. I want to pause here and name something important, because I think it clarifies exactly why stopping needing them is so much more threatening than even a dramatic exit or a public confrontation. A dramatic exit, however painful in the moment, still keeps the narcissist at the emotional center of the story. The villain, perhaps, but still central, still significant enough to warrant that level of reaction. Quiet, genuine self-sufficiency does something a dramatic exit never accomplishes. It removes them from the story's center entirely, relegating them to a supporting character in someone else's life, someone who used to matter and now, simply, doesn't in the way they once did. For a psychology built entirely around occupying the center of every relationship it touches, there is genuinely no more threatening position to be placed in than the periphery. This is also, I think, why the pattern we discussed in an earlier episode, narcissists mistaking strength for something to test, then flatter, then eventually resent, makes so much more sense once you understand this specific fear underneath it. Every escalating tactic a narcissist deploys against someone who's grown resistant to their usual playbook is, at its core, an attempt to avoid confronting exactly this: the reality that this particular person might have actually genuinely stopped needing them permanently in a way no amount of charm, guilt, or manufactured crisis can reverse. I want to be careful here to name something that matters for anyone watching this who's currently in the process of building this exact kind of self-sufficiency, because I don't want this episode to read as encouragement to build independence specifically in order to unsettle someone who hurt you. That's not actually the point. And building genuine self-sufficiency as a weapon aimed at someone else's reaction tends, ironically, to undermine the very thing that makes it destabilizing in the first place. Because performed independence, aimed at their reaction, is still, underneath the performance, a form of need. The real version, the one that actually produces the effect we're describing today, has to be built for its own sake, entirely independent of whether the narcissist ever notices, understands, or reacts to it at all. In part 2, we're going to look at exactly what this process of building genuine, unperformed self-sufficiency actually looks like in practice. The specific internal shifts that separate real independence from its performed imitation, what typically happens on a narcissist's end once they can no longer avoid confronting this particular fear, and why, ultimately, none of this should be understood as a strategy for making them suffer, but as something far more valuable: the actual architecture of a life that no longer requires their presence, their approval, or even their awareness to feel complete. Stick around, because that part is where this stops being about them entirely and becomes about something that was always meant to be yours alone. Let's talk about what genuine, unperformed self-sufficiency actually looks like in practice, because it's built differently than most people expect. The first shift, and it's a deceptively simple one, is the movement from proving to yourself that you're okay, to simply being occupied with your own life in a way that doesn't reference them at all. Performed independence tends to have a specific texture. It's often built around milestones you can point to, evidence you're gathering almost unconsciously for a case you might need to make someday, even if you never actually make it out loud. Real self-sufficiency doesn't accumulate evidence because it isn't building a case. It's simply absorbed in living, the way anyone is absorbed in a life that's genuinely, fully theirs. The test from an earlier episode applies again here. Would you still be doing this, still feel this way about it, if you knew with total certainty they would never find out? If the honest answer is yes, that's the real thing. If part of the motivation depends on it eventually reaching them, that's still performance, however well-intentioned. The second shift is what happens to your relationship with your own memory of the relationship. Performed independence often still organizes itself around the narrative of what happened, replaying it, refining your account of it, staying fluent in exactly how you'd explain the whole story if asked. Genuine self-sufficiency tends to involve something quieter and, honestly, less dramatic. The story simply becomes less central over time, not through active suppression, but because your attention has genuinely, organically redistributed itself toward things that have nothing to do with the relationship at all. You'll notice this shift less by trying to measure it directly and more by realizing, one day, that weeks passed without the story crossing your mind unprompted, and that realization arriving as mild surprise rather than effort is usually a good sign the shift is real. The third shift, and this is the one that takes the longest to build, is developing an internal locus of validation, robust enough that another person's absence, presence, opinion, or reaction simply doesn't move the needle on your sense of worth in either direction. This is the deepest layer of what we discussed in an earlier episode about the capacities that determine who survives a narcissist intact. And it's worth naming that this specific capacity, more than any of the others, is what actually produces the effect this whole two-part episode has been describing. It's not something you perform in front of anyone. It's something you carry quietly into every room, including rooms the narcissist will never enter. Now let's talk about what typically happens on a narcissist's end once they can no longer avoid confronting this particular fear, because it's worth understanding, even though, as we'll get to, it shouldn't be the point of any of this. The most common response is a kind of retreat into denial that becomes progressively harder to sustain. Early on, they'll often tell themselves a story that preserves their centrality. She's just putting on a brave face. He's obviously still hurting underneath it. This apparent thriving is temporary, a phase, a performance of its own. This story can hold for a surprisingly long time, particularly if the narcissist has limited direct access to accurate information about your actual internal state, which is one of the quieter benefits of genuine distance. But if evidence keeps accumulating that contradicts the story, mutual friends mentioning, without any charge attached to it, how well you seem to be doing, how settled and unbothered you appear, how little your life seems to reference the relationship at all, the denial becomes harder and harder to maintain without actively distorting more and more information to protect it. When denial finally becomes unsustainable, what often follows is a version of the grief we discussed in an earlier episode about narcissists losing someone who truly loved them, except with an additional, sharper edge to it here. Because this isn't just the loss of a person. It's the loss of a specific, load-bearing story about their own significance in that person's life. This grief, when it surfaces, is rarely oriented toward genuine remorse for what they did to the relationship. More often, it's oriented toward the unbearable recalibration this realization forces, a narcissist confronting, however briefly, however incompletely, the possibility that their impact on someone's life was smaller, more finite, more replaceable than their entire sense of self had always required it to be. I want to name something important here, because it's easy for this part of the episode to read as vindication, and I understand the appeal of that framing, especially after everything we've covered across this whole channel. But I want to gently redirect the emphasis because I think the real point sits somewhere else entirely. None of what we've described today, the collapsed toolkit, the unsustainable denial, the belated grief over lost centrality, should be understood as the actual goal of building genuine self-sufficiency. If you find yourself building independence specifically to produce that reaction in them, to watch the toolkit fail, to witness the grief arrive, you've quietly slipped back into a relationship with them that's organized around their reaction, just inverted, needing them to notice you're not needing, which is still, underneath it, a form of needing. The version of self-sufficiency that actually holds, that actually changes your life, rather than just changing your relationship to theirs, has nothing to do with what it does to them at all. Here's what I want you to actually take from this two-part episode, because I think it's easy to lose the real point somewhere in the psychology of why this destabilizes a narcissist so completely. The fact that genuine self-sufficiency happens to be their worst nightmare is a side effect, not a feature, of building a life that's actually fully yours. You are not constructing independence as a weapon. You're constructing it because a life organized around your own values, your own stability, your own sense of worth, that doesn't require anyone else's validation to hold steady, is simply a better, more genuinely peaceful way to live. One that happens, incidentally, to be the single thing a narcissist's psychology has no tools left to counter, precisely because it was never built with their reaction in mind at all. If you're in the process of building this right now, quietly, for yourself, whether or not it ever reaches anyone who used to need your need for them, I want you to know that's not a strategy playing out correctly. That's just you, finally living a life that belongs entirely to you. And that was always the whole point. independent of anything it does or doesn't do to anyone still watching from wherever they've ended up. If you want more of this, the real psychology underneath the behavior, and everything it actually takes to build a life that's genuinely fully yours, subscribe to Mind Horizon. I'll see you in the next one.